Hello, I'm Tom Bradby. Welcome to Talking Politics. Top of the list this week was Nigel Farage and reform. Again, a Tory multimillionaire has defected to be Treasurer. There is still talk of that elusive Musk donation. Meanwhile, there are new plans to build over more of the Green Belt. Robert and Anushka and I had a big discussion about that and many other issues, including, of course, Syria. I'm joined by Robert. Anushka will be joining us shortly. She is racing back from something and will come on stream as and when. I feel like we've talked quite a lot about Nigel Farage and reform, but new developments this week, what do you make of them and how serious are they? And how seriously, there's a lot of discussion, we talked about it last week, about the rise of reform, a lot of people speculating about whether it may supplant the Tory party. We've had these discussions a million times before with political parties going all the way back to the SDP, hasn't happened. Our political system makes it quite difficult for new parties to come on stream, but where do you think we really are?
I think we are at a critical juncture. Nick Candy, immensely wealthy property developer, signs up or just signed up to be the treasurer of reform. I mean, he personally has enough money to, help them professionalise, and he's pretty connected, so you've got to assume that he'll also be pretty good at raising money from other sources. Comes against the background of all this speculation that Elon Musk, world's wealthiest individual, may give tens of millions to reform. Nick Candy's wife, Holly Valance, quite a well-known, former pop star, celebrity, had already backed reform. The thing that, however, sort of strikes me most, a sort of feature of the personalities at the top of the Tory party and the Labour Party, it's very striking to me that neither Labour or the Conservative Party seem at this moment to really understand how to take on Nigel Farage. They're slightly floundering. They know he's a threat, but they genuinely, in my view, don't have a clue about how to combat him. And then, secondly, some call them the far right, some call them the populist right, but these are, parties of that ilk are on the rise across the West, particularly in Europe at the moment. And the other fundamental structural issue is Labour won this massive majority in Parliament on the back of a relatively small share of the popular vote. It shows you that in first past the post, you can game the system to win a majority by simply making sure your votes are in the right place. People like Nick Candy are on board to help Nigel Farage build his votes in the right place. In the last episode, we pointed out that they don't just pose a threat to the Tories. Most of their votes last time came from the Tory party, Tory defectors, but by no means all. And they are second place to Labour in, I think, something over 80 seats in the country. It is that, they represent a threat to both parties. And, this phrase that we've all been using, the efficiency of the vote, if Nigel Farage using social media, and he seems to be personally quite adept at using social media and using digital marketing techniques and data gathering techniques, manages over the next 2 or 3 years to build support in marginal constituencies, you've got to take the prospect of reform breaking through in a really fundamental sense, really seriously, even to the extent of saying, they could form a government.
A couple of things just to throw into the discussion. One is, it seems to me that the right-wing ecosphere is kind of more coherent than it used to be. You used to have like the Murdoch papers that could swing right, but sometimes swung left, certainly under Blair and then briefly under Brown. Yet now you've got Reform comes out, they give interviews to GB News. I feel like GB News is probably more aligned with the thinking of the Telegraph. There's a more coherent, rounded right-wing ecosystem, which seems to me to tilt more just in the way it sort of thinks towards reform than it does to the Tories, which strikes me as potentially quite dangerous for reform. We talked about Tim Montgomery, who we both agree is somebody who probably we feel speaks more coherently for the average Tory activist than most other people at Westminster, has gone to reform. So that's just one thing I know, and I'm just wondering what you make of that. And the second point to note is that there was a YouGov poll out this week. In fact, there's been a couple of polls out this week, and they've shown various things. One of them was that they discussed issues and views and labels and how popular they are. And one of them showed that environmentalism was the most popular ism that of all those that they compared, whereas conservatism, for example, was way down on the list. And equally well, there was another poll saying, the number of people who would rejoin the EU now really quite high, 63 against 37, I think, from memory. Both of those things suggest that, so on the one hand, you've got this quite evolved right-wing ecosphere, and on the other hand, you've got the fact that it seems that in terms of where the country is right now, it isn't in reform territory. What do you make of all that? Sorry, there's the longest bloody question in here.
I'm not sure that's a question or a lecture, but nonetheless. I mean, there's a lot to break through.
Yeah.
So, again, Farage himself seems to be adept at using modern media, more adept than, for example, at the moment, Badenoch and certainly Starmer. Personally, he's mentioned last week he's got this on not very much effort. He's got 1 million+ TikTok followers. Not quite, in the absolute stratosphere of celebs, but 1 million for a politician in Britain is not boring white man. Is not bad. And then, yes, the sort of populist right has very much an outlet within more traditional media, whether you talk about GB News. Telegraph, I think, would still think of itself as being a Tory paper, but you're right, it reflects, some of its views very much reflect the sort of reform way of thinking. Look, one shouldn't forget, though, it's not that long ago when we were children that the British media was divided between a Labour press.
Time ago when we were children.
But nonetheless, in those days, it was very straightforward. There were Labour papers and there were Tory papers, and they didn't really change. We then had years of greater fluidity, and then the social media, digital fragmentation. It seems to me one of the things that's slightly odd about all the parties, with the possible exception of Reform, is they are way more obsessed with the traditional media than they really ought to be. When, my own view is that, television remains very powerful. I'm not sure newspapers really do, and the real battleground it should be digital, and I'm not sure Labour and the Tories really quite get that to the extent to which they should. So that's the media question. What were the other two? Sorry, there was one of the...
Well, I was talking to you about the media, but then I was also talking to you about how, if you look at surveys of where the country is on issues, it just doesn't seem to be in right-wing territory at the moment.
Well, except that there are... So you said environmentalism is something millions of people are absolutely passionate about and provides them with very much a cause. But if you're Reform, and seemingly increasingly if you're Kemi Badenoch's Tory party, you think there are lots of votes to be picked up from being the challenge to going for green energy. And, one of the way Reform has definitely picked up support, and the Tories think they can learn from this, is, to challenge the conversion of our homes to heat pumps and green power, challenge the move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So we have very much a divided country in that sense. We ought to devote longer to this whole issue about why this government is so frightened of doing anything that looks like seriously moving us nearer to the European Union or seriously putting us back on a track towards rejoining the EU, given, as you say, that the opinion polls rather show that's where the mood of the British public is, that we should be thinking about, if not joining the EU, rejoining the single market and the customs union. And I mean, the reason it's really odd, the government's position at the moment, there are two reasons why it's really odd. One is public opinion has moved in that direction, and you'd normally expect any government, particularly government that's got a popularity problem at the moment, maybe thinking about, well, what do people actually want us to do? Secondly, the thing that they desperately need, and they talk about it all the time, and it was their big slogan in the election campaigns, they've got to get the growth rate up. Whatever you think about their plans to increase investment, to get the growth rate up, and I personally think it's a good thing, it'll take years for that to feed through to growth. Okay. Rejoining the single market or the currency union would be a quick, positive hit to growth. Okay.
As regular listeners will know by now, we record this podcast on a Wednesday around Prime Minister's questions. So here are some of the key exchanges from the chamber.
He seemed to want to talk about immigration. So let's talk about immigration. 4 years ago, the Prime Minister signed a letter demanding that foreign criminals be allowed to stay in Britain. Dozens of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs repeatedly signed these letters insisting that rapists and murderers be allowed to stay here.
The number now, under their watch, of migrants coming to this country, nearly 1 million, is over 4 times the number when we're in the EU. They lost control of the borders.
He is the one who was repeatedly signing letters. He even asked us to pause all deportations. He asked us to pause all deportations. He doesn't want to talk about his past, Mr. Speaker, but that letter is just the tip of the iceberg. There is more. The Prime Minister actually complained that the immigration system was working to deter migrants rather than provide support.
Mr. Speaker, I'd invite her to tell us what went wrong under the last government, but it'd take us all afternoon.
If America walks away and steps away, will he step up and work with other allies to provide British leadership over Syria?
We all welcome the fall of Assad. I hope this can be a turning point for Syria, a much-needed turning point, but that is by no means guaranteed, and that is why we've been speaking intently and intensely with our allies in the region across the globe.
I'm pleased to say Anushka has joined us, fresh from her interview. Can we just say one thing? I want to discuss one thing about PMQs. I'm not sure any of us would think that was a PMQs to necessarily set the world alight. And I don't want to raise the question that I ask every week to the point of boring you and the audience about how long he's going to keep banging on about the years of Tory misrule. But what I just sat there wondering, what would happen actually genuinely if he just answered the question and stopped? Now, and I completely understand it's politics. You say, well, you messed it up, we're fixing it, you messed it up, we're fixing it. But actually, if you took a different strategy and decided to answer the question, I found myself thinking, would that automatically lead you into trouble because you're having to give real answers can be picked apart? What do you both think about that? Is really answering the question a doomed strategy at PMQs?
I mean, if I was his advisor, I would say answer the question. But I don't know if that's just because I share your frustration, Tom, when you're watching it and all you get are these scripted responses about how bad the other side is doing.
What do you think, Robert?
Look, in general, and I've been banging on about this for years, as Anushka, I just think leading politicians have made a huge error in not answering questions in general, whether they're at PMQs or whether they're questions put to them by me, you, Anushka. I think we're living through this period of a crisis of trust in the way we run things and in our politicians, and they're not going to turn it round unless they change their whole attitude. I was quite struck in that context. We talked earlier in the programme about how neither Labour or the Tories have an answer at the moment to the Farage reform surge. I thought Stephen Flynn, just on Twitter, made a very good point about the exchange between Kemi Badenoch and the Prime Minister, which was all about who's softer on immigration. And he simply said, there's only one person who wins from this race to the bottom on immigration, and it's neither Kemi Badenoch or the Prime Minister. And I think he's right about that. If she wants to go on that, she will never out-Farage, and nor will the Prime Minister. But also, so they're sort of mad to go down
Well,
this
the
road.
other thing about all discussions on immigration, which I know we've debated before, and we've been having this debate for 10 years, but I just think they both palpably sound ridiculous. I mean, they've both done nothing about. They've both run policies that have very, very high immigration, and that may be a good thing or a bad thing. We've debated that. They debate that. But what doesn't make any sense is to keep going on about being tough on immigration and do nothing about it. They've never done anything about it.
Do you know? Just on the immigration point, I actually think the letter that Kemi Badenoch was referring to, which Conservatives have helpfully sent round so we can have a look at, is quite interesting, because it was Keir Starmer when he was trying to become Labour leader, and he was trying to woo anti-Brexit groups on the left. And he wrote this letter. It's like a 3-page long letter in which it really is kind of like, it really is very pro-migration. He talks about how proud he was to be Jeremy Corbyn's shadow immigration minister, and he talks about how you've really got to end this scapegoating of migrants, and how he really believes in free movement, and how he thinks that detention centres to deport certain foreign criminals, as she was saying, although he doesn't use that language exactly, should be shut down. And I do think there's quite a serious point in there, which is that Keir Starmer, we've talked about this before, has been on a journey in terms of his politics. Some would say deliberately so, leaning to the left to win the leadership, now leaning to the right because he thinks that's what you need to do as Prime Minister. And I do think there is probably a trust issue in there. So I did actually find the letter she had dug out quite interesting. And obviously the Conservatives think that because Keir Starmer has not put as one of his 6 milestones, was it, rather than foundations, the idea that they're going to bring down migration, it's something that of a weak spot for him. He probably agrees, although I do absolutely agree with Robert that the Stephen Flynn point is probably quite a sensible one, which is that maybe Nigel Farage wins.
But I think it's important, though, to develop something that Anushka has just said there. So in this PMQs, Keir Starmer actually made the very sensible point that migration levels were significantly lower. They may have been politically contentious. They were significantly lower when we were in the EU than what they've been in the last few years since we left. Now, one of the reasons for that, and I've talked about this with you before, Tom, is when we were in the EU, young people would come and work here, quite large numbers, and then quite often, when they wanted to have a family, they would leave again, right? So the people who are coming here, because of free movement, one of the advantages of free movement is, you didn't have to stay to be guaranteed of a home here. One of the reasons why immigration levels are causing people so much anxiety now is that when people are coming, not the students, but when people are coming to work, many of them are coming and they want to stay here forever. And it's a permanent swelling on the demands of the state and demands on our public services. And one of the odd things, we talked about this earlier in the programme, about Keir Starmer's position, there is some, he now feels embarrassed by that letter that the Tories, he probably feels embarrassed by that letter that the Tories have dug out, because he thinks that in the context of politics as it is today, it's impossible to make the case either for immigration or indeed, as I said earlier, for rejoining the EU. But weirdly, if he looked at opinion polls and he thought through the logic of his position, he could genuinely make the case that if we rejoined the EU, there might not be, frankly, quite such an immigration problem, and there would definitely be a windfall for the British economy. But he's too frightened against the backdrop of the events of the last few years to even begin to make that case.
Anushka,
the way they won the election was by winning in Leave constituencies where many working class traditional Labour voters voted to leave. The idea that Labour is going to start talking now about rejoining the EU and trying to make the argument that it's going to reduce immigration is obviously for the birds. I mean, like, it's obviously not something they're going to be thinking about at the moment.
They may not be, Anushka, but my argument would be, given how difficult they're finding, for example, the aim of boosting growth, my own view is if they don't start to have the courage to talk about these things more honestly, to get back to your honest point, they're going to lose the next election.
Can I, Anushka, I just want to bring you in because Robert and I were having a conversation at the very start about a whole bunch of a kind of opinion polling this week that showed various things. But one of the things it showed, again, was a pretty large majority in favour of rejoining the EU, 63% off 30 against 37%.
But salience is quite low. Yeah, so these things might be true, but salience is quite low. And if we actually had another referendum, A, it would be very divisive, and B, those opinion polls would shift. We don't know really what that would mean. I just, you know.
Well, no, opinion polls have been quite consistent now. Now, you may be right, and that they're not real. And actually, if there was another referendum, or even talk of joining the single market, or even anything else, they would begin to drift away again. I think I completely accept there's a sort of element in which people who felt they'd made a once in a lifetime vote might feel betrayed. That's a factor. There's a factor of kind of making us look, frankly, ridiculous to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world if we come back and say, oh, we can't want to rejoin now. That doesn't make us look good. But as we've discussed, the reality of it is that the opinion polls do seem to be telling quite a consistent story, and the economy isn't growing. Those are the two reasons that make you think, does that force Keir Starmer to start to have to reconsider it? That's my question.
Well, I think this idea of can you get somewhat closer to the EU in a serious way if you don't actually look at the big institutions like the customs union, like the single market, that is difficult to do. I've always thought if there was one he would look at, it would be more the customs union than the single market because of the issue with free movement. Although obviously what you're saying, Robert, is right. How does the previous Conservative government and now Labour government, explain why immigration has risen so sharply since a Brexit vote that people thought would put a cap on immigration to some degree? And obviously there are quite interesting issues going on around shortages in particular professions, for example, care work, all of which need to be fixed by training people in this country to try and do those jobs. And what people would argue, rather than necessarily suddenly like moving back to free movement as a way to, solve that, which is obviously one option. Another option is to do the thing that politicians have been saying they would do for years and years and years, but they never do, which is to actually, change the structures in this country so we don't get those shortages in those particular sectors at the same degree. And the other argument I think you can have, by the way, is should student numbers be in the main numbers? And obviously politicians have always been scared of going there because it looks like they're changing the rules. But clearly, foreign students coming to this country is a really good thing for the economy.
I think we should make one other point just on this, because we have all sat through so many public finance briefings on this, and it's not a widely understood point. But part of the whole thing that was always said about immigration from Eastern Europe, to your point, was that people were coming here, we hadn't had to educate them, they were here for some of their most economically productive time because they, were paying tax here and working here and contributing to the economy. And then, as you say, they often then went home, so we didn't have to care for them when they were older and all the rest of it. And the idea that people come here to stay has all kinds of impacts. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I'm just saying that was one of the things I think we all found frustrating in the EU referendum, because you sat through all these briefings and then you tried to explain this over and over again as it was explained to us, and like nobody was listening. You were shouting into a void, but fair enough. But just moving on, obviously one of the things, if you do have a high immigration policy that we've talked about a lot, is that it does put pressure on things like housing. Clearly, the Labour government trying to toughen up today or this week, saying, look, we're going to build on more of the green belt. What do you both make of that? Are they likely to push it through? Is it going to falter on the same rocks that every planning reform attempt has, or do you think it might actually meaningfully change things?
Look, at the moment, we're not at the phase, it seems to me, where we should say, if Keir Starmer says something, the opposite's going to happen. I mean, Keir Starmer has been absolutely clear, as has Angela Rayner, that they are going to drive through some massive building projects, whether it's prisons, whether it's data centres. They are going to accelerate planning decisions. They are going to make it harder for locals and councils to frustrate these big projects. And the same is true of housing. That is what they're saying. In a few days' time, we're going to get a revised national planning framework. These are the overall rules for developments and planning. Then next year, we're going to get this broken down into local planning, local plans. And then, presumably we get shovels in the ground. And if we don't, then your scepticism will be well-founded. I mean, they seem to have a process underway. What do you think, Anushka? Do we believe that the process will yield these big developments, or do we think this is just good intentions that will founder?
Well, a couple of things. I think that the targets that they are aiming for are unbelievably high. That 1.5 million over 5 years, if you break it down per year, it's 300,000 per year. They say they're going to have higher numbers than that later in the Parliament, so they're going to lift up to it. And I think we've shown on ITV News that the last time a government crossed that threshold was in 1977. Haven't come close to it since then. And before then, only ever crossed that threshold as a result of state-built social housing. And when we're yet to understand fully what the mix of this will be and how much they're relying on the private sector, because the private sector has never taken us over that line. So the ambition needs to be big. Obviously, they are talking about something which is quite radical, which is to allow more of the green belt to be built on than we previously expected. They talked about, using disused petrol stations and so on. This sounds like they want to go further than that in terms of the green belt that they're going to build on. I mean, I think looking at those figures and how far away the targets are, arguably they do need to do something quite radical, but you can already see that they're getting quite a backlash around it, which I think is going to be difficult. In terms of the scepticism, though, I read the planning section of the OBR report on the day that the budget happened. And I thought it was really interesting because, the OBR score planning reform at the moment as 0 for growth. And the reason that they do that is basically because they are massively sceptical of what previous governments have tried to do on planning and have never achieved. So, of course, Robert, you're totally right that we should be open-minded to it. They've put in place huge targets. They've asked us to judge them on those targets. But it is also the case that, a big organisation like the OBR with some very clever people in it is not convinced about it. Though they do say, and I think it'll be really interesting to look at how the OBR responds to the details when we have it, that they are going to keep a close eye on it and see if they would change their mind slightly. But I was struck that they literally scored it 0.
Final question for today. Obviously, massive events in Syria. No one's going to mourn the passing of the despicable Assad regime. I mean, absolutely electrifying and intriguing to see the rebels moving in, taking over government departments. Quite a difficult question for the government and for the Prime Minister. I mean, obviously, we view the main rebel group as a terrorist group. Are they going to change that? How do they react? What do they think is most likely? What are you both hearing of how the government is reading it and thinking about it?
So I thought Ed Davey asked a very good question. President-elect Donald Trump's tweet about Syria was shocking, I thought. Capital letters. This is nothing to do with us. Yeah. We're going to, So I thought Ed Davey's question to the Prime Minister, which is, will you try and corral other European governments to fill an American leadership gap, if in terms of state building, trying to make sure that whatever emerges there shares some decent, humane values, even if it doesn't emerge as a proper democracy. It seems to me, actually, given our history, we don't want to act in a colonial way, but I think we do have a sort of moral responsibility to think about what kind of support we can give to the Syrian people in those circumstances. The other aspect of all of this, I mean, we all hope, when we saw the toppling of Assad. It felt like, in a very gloomy year, it felt like quite a positive moment. But of course, there now are these other incredibly important uncertainties around all of this. If you are Putin, you probably take the view that it is now even more important that he's seen not to lose in Ukraine. So I think Putin's flexibility in the peace negotiations that we're expecting very soon to be initiated by Trump, I think Putin is going to ask for more in those circumstances. And then there's the whole question of Israel and Iran, where, Iran is looking weak as a result of a lot of stuff that's been happening, whether it's the crushing of Hezbollah, whether it's what's happening in Syria. There are some people who think there is now a higher probability of Israel taking direct, rather significant military action against Iran directly. So, there are all these ramifications that are really serious.
Anushka, final word today to you on Syria.
Well, I just think the impression you get from ministers at the moment is that everything is just on pause because no one is quite sure which way this is going to go. As you say, the group that has taken over, HTS, is a terrorist organisation. That's, with historic links to al-Qaeda, but its leader al-Jilani has moved away from that and has said that he wants it to be a more moderate group. Speaking to Syrians who I know, they also feel like they're in a kind of pause situation, very, very happy that the Assad regime has gone, but nervous about what comes next. And I thought it was interesting that the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was talking about, obviously, we've paused at the moment taking asylum applications from Syrians because he was arguing we don't know what's going to happen. And it could be that whilst people return to Syria, there could end up being another flow back out of Syria because of the instability of the situation at the moment. So,
and just on that point, because we've been talking a lot about immigration, obviously one of the concerns is actually if it becomes a, more stable, in a sense, government that makes it harder for people who are connected to Assad to stay there. I mean, do we necessarily want, to be taking, asylum seekers who are close to the Assad regime? So all of this is all complicated stuff.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, whether you were watching or listening. Remember, you can view new episodes on ITVX every Wednesday. And if you're enjoying it, please do hit subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to ensure you won't miss out on an episode. But that's it. Goodbye.